The phone tilted to the right. Portia adjusted the angle, then hit record. Out on the concrete yard behind the mansion, under the July sun in Greenwich, Connecticut, a brown-haired young woman was kneeling on the ground. Both knees were pressed against the unyielding, sun-baked surface. In front of her was a plate of rice, placed directly on the cement, wedged between two water bowls meant for dogs. To her left, a Neapolitan mastiff named Caesar had lowered his head and was eating. To her right, the second one, Nero, lay stretched out, his muzzle wet, his tail wagging slowly. She was eating with them, at the same position, at the same height, on the same ground. Beside her, an old woman sat in a rusted garden chair, whose back had already lost 3 screws. She was 83 years old. Her hair was pure white. Her hand shook so badly that the plate of rice on her lap trembled with every movement, and grains fell onto her dress without her noticing. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. She had forgotten how to cry a long time ago, or perhaps there were no tears left to fall. Portia stood in the back doorway, her back against the oak frame, one hand holding her phone, the other holding a glass of Sauvignon Blanc. She sent the video into the group chat with 3 laughing emojis. Guess who's having lunch with Caesar and Nero today? 6 friends stood around her, wine glasses in hand, watching as if it were some entertainment after lunch. The brown-haired young woman didn't look up. She chewed slowly, swallowed slowly. Her back stayed straight. Even as sweat ran down the length of her spine and soaked through the thin fabric of her shirt, even as the skin on her knees began to take the imprint of the concrete, she refused to become the thing Portia wanted her to become, not because she was strong, but because Katerina was watching her. So Brielle ate, with an unwavering posture, slowly, as though the hot concrete beneath her knees were the oak dining table she herself had served Portia at for 5 years. The old woman, Caterina Moretti, 83 years old, lifted the spoon toward her mouth with trembling hands. Her hand was so weak that half the rice fell back onto the plate before it could reach her lips. Brielle stopped eating, gently steadied her hand, and helped the spoon reach her mouth. "Eat slowly, Nana," she said softly, quietly enough that only the old woman could hear. "I'm right here." No one else heard those words, but Katerina heard them, and her hand trembled a little less. Portia stopped recording, took a sip of wine, turned to her friends, her voice light and careless. "She's been doing this for 5 years. You'd think she'd learn her place by now. But this was what Portia didn't know, what no one in this 12-bedroom house knew. The woman kneeling on the concrete outside, the woman Portia called the help, the woman Portia made eat beside the dogs while she filmed and sent the video to her friends for their amusement. That woman was the only reason Caterina Moretti could still remember her grandson's name. She was the only one who had realized the old woman was being poisoned day by day with sedatives. She was the only one keeping her alive inside the very house that should have protected her. And directly beneath their feet, exactly 1 floor below this scene, in the basement Portia had never once stepped into, Declan Moretti was sitting there, Caterina's grandson, master of the house, the boss who controlled half the underworld of the northeastern United States. He didn't know yet that his grandmother was eating rice beside the dogs right above his head, didn't know yet that his fiancée was laughing and filming it. But he was about to know, because at this very moment, on the 2nd floor, a man was looking through the window. He saw everything, the concrete, the 2 dogs, the trembling old woman, the young woman kneeling with her back straight, and Portia, smiling. That man's name was Rafe, and he was walking downstairs. But to understand why Brielle Ashford, 27 years old, without a penny to her name, without a single family member left except for her 82-year-old grandmother with Alzheimer's in a nursing home, could kneel on concrete beside dogs and not stand up and walk away, we have to go back. Back to Burlington, Vermont, to a 14-year-old girl standing in a cemetery watching her father's coffin being lowered into the earth, and to the final promise she made to her mother on a hospital bed 5 years later. Because that was where everything began. Because every time Brielle lowered her head and said, "Yes, ma'am," to Portia, in her mind she heard Ruth's voice, the sound of her grandmother's voice when she still remembered Brielle's name, when she could still say, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." Brielle lowered herself onto the abrasive backyard ground beside 2 dogs, so that voice wouldn't go out, so that every Sunday afternoon, when she held her grandmother's hand in the nursing home only 15 minutes away by car, Ruth would still be there, still sitting by the window, still saying, "You remind me of someone I loved very much." even though she couldn't remember who that person was. And Brielle would smile, swallow her tears, and say, "I love you too, Grandma." Every time, the same words, like a ritual she would never abandon, even if she had to kneel beside dogs to keep it alive. If this story moved you, hit like. Just one tap. But it helps Brielle reach more people. Share this with someone you know who is also suffering in silence because of someone else. And subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, because what happens when Rafe walks down that staircase is something you won't want to miss. Burlington, Vermont. 13 years before Brielle Ashford's knees were pressed into the hot concrete in the backyard of the Greenwich mansion, she was a 14-year-old girl, standing in the middle of Mount Calvary Cemetery in a black dress borrowed from her mother, watching her father's coffin descend into the ground. Thomas Ashford, a carpenter, 41 years old, had died when scaffolding collapsed at a construction site on the outskirts of the city. People said he had died instantly, without pain. Brielle didn't believe that. She looked at the oak coffin that her father's co-workers had built for him, and she thought that he must have suffered, because every carpenter knows that when wood breaks, it makes a sound, and a person can't break without making one too. But Brielle made no sound. She stood beside her mother, one hand holding her grandmother Ruth's hand, and she didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because she was holding the two women beside her upright. 14 years old, and Brielle had already begun doing the thing she would do for the rest of her life, standing straight so others would have something to lean on. After the funeral, the little wooden house on Maple Street lost the smell of sawdust. The workshop in the backyard closed. Her mother, Linda Ashford, a nurse at the community hospital, took on extra night shifts at a nursing home. 2 jobs, 6 days a week. Brielle started helping in the kitchen at the Italian restaurant at the end of the street after school, washing dishes until 9 at night, then going home to cook for Ruth and read to her before bed. Every Sunday morning, Ruth still kneaded dough in the kitchen, and Brielle stood beside her learning how to roll it evenly, how to crimp the edges of a pie crust with the tip of a fork, how to dust flour across the table so nothing would stick. Those mornings were the only thing in the house that didn't change after her father died. Then that changed too. Brielle was 19 when her mother sat down at the kitchen table on a November evening, placed both hands on the surface, and said 3 words Brielle would never forget. "Lung cancer, baby. Late stage." The doctor said 4 to 6 months. Linda Ashford lived for 4. 4 months in which Brielle drove home from her college dorm every day, sat beside her mother's bed, changed the sheets, measured out medicine, took her temperature, and pretended that final exams still mattered. 4 months in which Ruth stood in the doorway of the sick room every morning and asked, "Linda, are you going to work today?" Because she had already begun forgetting that her daughter was dying. On the last night, Linda held Brielle's hand. Her mother's hand was so light that Brielle had to look down to make sure she was still holding on. Linda spoke in a hoarse voice, 1 word at a time, as though each one cost all the strength she had left. "Take care of Grandma Ruth. Promise me," Brielle said. "I promise, Mom." And Linda closed her eyes. Not then, but 3 hours later, at 3 in the morning, while Brielle was dozing in the chair beside the bed. She woke because of the silence. Not ordinary silence, the kind of silence that comes when a room suddenly has 1 less person breathing in it. Brielle dropped out of college in her 2nd year. No one forced her. No one needed to. She looked at Ruth standing in the kitchen, asking "Where's Linda?" for the 3rd time in 1 morning. And she knew that a bachelor's degree couldn't cook for her, couldn't take her to appointments, couldn't sit beside her at midnight when she woke in a panic and didn't know where she was. Brielle was 20 years old, alone, taking in her 75-year-old grandmother, who was slipping into the early stages of Alzheimer's. She did everything. Waiting tables in the morning at a diner on Church Street, cleaning houses for 3 families in the afternoon, babysitting on Friday and Saturday nights. Money came in and money went out, and the distance between the two kept growing thinner, like a thread pulled too tight. Ruth needed medicine, needed specialists, needed things that Brielle's 2 hands, working 14 hours a day, still couldn't afford to buy. Every night, after Ruth fell asleep, Brielle sat on the bed in the small room that had once belonged to her parents. She opened her phone. Not to call anyone, because there was no one to call. She opened the photo album. She scrolled from the latest picture back to the first, a picture of Ruth from the month before, her eyes empty, sitting by the window saying nothing. She scrolled backward. A picture of Ruth from 1 year earlier, smiling, but her eyes had already begun to drift. Further back. 2 years. 3 years. Ruth laughing wide, holding a tray of hot pastries, flour on her cheek. 4 years. Ruth holding Brielle on high school graduation day, saying, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," and Brielle could hear every word in the picture, even though pictures make no sound. She kept scrolling back through time as though she could rewind to the day Ruth still remembered her name, still knew who she was, still said those words. Then she turned the screen off, closed her eyes, wrote nothing, said nothing, because Brielle wasn't someone who kept a journal or whispered to the dark. She was someone who did, and tomorrow morning she would get up at 5 and keep doing. That girl grew up, and 13 years later, she would kneel on hot concrete beside 2 dogs. But before that, she had to find a house behind iron gates. Brielle found the job posting on a March night, at 2 in the morning, on the screen of a phone with a cracked corner while Ruth slept in the next room. She had scrolled past hundreds of listings like it over the previous 2 years, enough to know the formula by heart. Low pay, no benefits, flexible hours as the polite way of saying we will call you whenever we want, and you don't get to say no. But this posting was different. The Moretti family, Greenwich, Connecticut, housekeeper and elder caregiver, $1,800 a week, room and board included, and one line that Brielle read 3 times to make sure her tired eyes weren't deceiving her. Full health insurance for dependents. She didn't care about the money. She didn't care about Greenwich or who the Moretti family was. She saw only one thing, that insurance was enough to cover specialized care for Ruth at Maple Grove Nursing Home, exactly 15 minutes by car from the address in the listing. 15 minutes, close enough that every Sunday she could still hold Ruth's hand and hear her say that sentence. Brielle submitted the application before dawn. 2 weeks later, she drove her 2007 Honda Civic through the wrought iron gates of the Moretti estate for the first time, and the world she knew stopped at those gates. On the other side stood something Brielle had never seen in real life. A gray stone mansion with 12 bedrooms rising in the middle of a lawn trimmed so sharply it looked measured with a ruler, evergreen hedges taller than a man, and a natural stone driveway leading to a front door of oak so heavy it looked as though it would take 2 people to open it. And at the entrance, 2 Neapolitan mastiffs lay on either side of the steps like guard statues, folds of wrinkled skin hanging over their faces, their eyes lazy but watching every step she took from the moment she got out of the car. Caesar and Nero. Brielle didn't know their names yet. She knew only that each of them weighed more than she did. And they looked at her as though they were deciding whether she deserved to pass through the gate. She was led into the house through the side service entrance, not the front door. The man who led her was the butler, an older man who spoke very little, and he didn't explain why they were going through the side entrance. Brielle didn't ask. The hallway inside was laid with white and gray marble, the ceiling so high that her footsteps echoed like they did in a church, and everything was so clean that Brielle felt every speck of dust on her worn shoes was an insult. She met Declan Moretti first, or rather, she saw him pass by. He stepped out of the study into the hallway, just as she was walking through, tall, broad, shouldered, in a black suit without a tie, and his footsteps made no sound at all on the marble floor, as though he had trained himself to move without letting the world know he was coming. He looked at her, nodded, a single nod, neither slow nor fast, neither cold nor warm, just enough to acknowledge that he knew she existed in this house. Then he kept walking. Brielle stood there watching him go, and something in her stomach tightened. Not fear, but the feeling a small animal gets when it has stepped into the territory of something much larger. She met Caterina Moretti in the first-floor sitting room. The old woman was sitting in an armchair by the window, 83 years old, but her back was still straight, her eyes still bright, her hands resting on her lap like someone waiting for a person who was long overdue. When Brielle entered, she looked up, and instead of looking her over from head to toe the way wealthy homeowners usually look at domestic help, she looked straight into her eyes. Then she reached out with both hands and took Brielle's hands in hers. Her hands were small and warm and trembling slightly, and she said in a voice touched with Italian and English, "You have kind eyes, ragazza. Stay." Brielle swallowed, because it was the first time in 2 years that anyone had looked into her eyes and said anything other than how much or clean this. She met Portia Kensington last. Portia was standing at the top of the second-floor staircase, in a cream dress, gold heels, her hair freshly done, her perfume arriving 3 steps before she did. She looked Brielle up and down, Not into her eyes, but at her clothes, her shoes, her hands, the way she stood. And in that look, Brielle didn't see an assessment of competence. She saw an assessment of rank. Portia was measuring where Brielle stood in the hierarchy of this house, and she finished measuring in less than 3 seconds. You cook, you clean, you take care of the old woman. Portia's voice was neither high nor low, neither hot nor cold, flat as the marble floor beneath her heels. You don't speak unless spoken to. You stay invisible. Clear? Brielle looked at Portia, looked at the eyes that held nothing behind them except absolute certainty that she was right, and Brielle said, "Yes, ma'am." Those 2 words came out of her mouth so easily, so gently, that she almost didn't feel the bitterness. Almost. That was the first day. Brielle entered that house through the back kitchen door. She would not walk through the front door for 5 years. Portia wasn't cruel from the beginning. Her cruelty came in layers, room by room, like someone building a brick wall by placing one more brick each day until, by the time Brielle realized she was trapped, the wall had already risen over her head. The front door was the first brick. In her first week working there, Brielle entered through the main entrance because no one had told her she couldn't. Portia stood at the foot of the staircase, watched her walk through the oak doorway, and said in a calm voice, as if commenting on the weather, "The front door is for family and guests. You are not family, and you are not a guest. Use the back kitchen entrance." Brielle nodded. From that day on, she walked around through the backyard, past the place where Caesar and Nero lay, past the tool shed, and into the house through the narrow door beside the sink. She used that path every day for 5 years, until the grass along the back trail had been trampled dead into a strip of bare dirt that no one but her ever stepped on. The kitchen was the second brick. Portia began inspecting every dish Brielle cooked, as if she were a health inspector. The sauce is too thick, throw it out. The rice is too soft, make it again. The meat is overcooked by 2 minutes, toss it. Every week, nearly half the food Brielle prepared was ordered into the trash by Portia, and Brielle had to start over from the beginning, standing at the stove for another 2 or 3 hours, while her back ached and her eyes burned from lack of sleep. Portia never tasted any of it. She only looked, frowned, and shook her head, because the point was never the quality of the food. The point was to make Brielle understand that no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, the power to decide whether she was good enough or not still belonged to Portia. Katerina's room was the third brick, and this one was the heaviest. 6 months after Brielle began working there, Portia ordered Katerina moved from the large second-floor bedroom, the one with windows facing the garden and a bed wide enough for her to turn comfortably, up to the attic room on the 3rd floor. The attic room was only a third the size of the old one. With a ceiling so low, Brielle had to duck when she entered, sweltering in the summer because the roof trapped the heat, and freezing in the winter because there was no separate heater. "She doesn't know where she is anyway," Portia said when Brielle stood looking at the new room with its narrow twin bed and dim yellow ceiling bulb. "A big room is wasted on someone who can't tell the difference between big and small anymore." On the first night Katerina slept in the attic, Brielle secretly carried up 2 extra blankets from the storage room and tucked them around her. And she did that every night for the next 4 years, summer and winter alike, because blankets weren't only for warmth. Blankets were a way of letting her know that someone remembered she was here. The bathroom was the 4th brick. Second year, Portia had a workman come install a portable toilet in the tool shed beside the garage, the kind of blue plastic toilet used on construction sites, set between shovels, hose, and the lawn mower. "That's yours," Portia said. "Don't let me see you using the bathrooms inside. Ever." Brielle stood looking at the plastic toilet in the shed, thick with the smell of gasoline from the mower, and she nodded, and she said, "Yes, ma'am." And she stepped back outside, and she didn't cry, because crying in that house was a luxury she couldn't afford. The dining room was the 5th brick. Also in the 2nd year, Portia cut Katerina's portions. "She eats too much. Cut it down." Brielle watched the old woman's plate grow smaller and smaller, watched her trembling hand lift the spoon, and she began giving half of her own portion to her at every meal. Half became 2/3. 2/3 became almost all of it. Brielle began eating only 1 meal a day, usually whatever was left after Katerina finished. Sometimes a slice of bread with water, sometimes nothing at all. She lost 4 kilograms in the first 6 months. No one noticed, because no one looked at her long enough to notice. The hallway was next. 3rd year, Portia made a new rule. Brielle was not allowed to walk through the main hall after 9 at night. "I don't want to see you when I'm relaxing." From then on, after 9, Brielle moved through the 12-bedroom house by way of the back staircase near the kitchen and the narrow servant corridors, the passages Portia's guests never saw, never even knew existed, like veins buried inside the walls. Brielle walked through them every night, soundless, unseen, like a ghost inside the very house she cleaned for 14 hours a day. And through all of it, Declan Moretti was away. In New York, in Boston, in Chicago, wherever business took him, and every time he came home, the estate became a stage set. Portia played the perfect fiancée. The house gleamed. Katerina was brought down from the attic to the first-floor sitting room and placed on the sofa like a display piece. Brielle disappeared into the kitchen, as though she had never existed at all. Declan saw the surface, the shining marble floors, his grandmother seated in the sitting room, hot food on the table, and the surface was always perfect, because Brielle was the one polishing it. Every room taken from her was one more reason to leave. But Brielle didn't leave, because there were 2 old women who needed her to stay. Every Sunday afternoon, her only day off each week, Brielle drove her old Honda Civic 15 minutes from the estate to Maple Grove Nursing Home. She took the same road, passed the same intersection, parked in the same place in the lot, stepped through the same glass doors, nodded to the same nurse at the front desk, and walked down the same hallway that smelled of disinfectant, mixed with artificial lavender from the diffuser in the corner. Room 214. The door was always slightly open. Inside, the small room was clean and spare, with a single bed, a bedside table, a plastic chair by the window, and above the bed, the only photograph in the room, Brielle on her high school graduation day, smiling wide in a blue gown, her arms around Ruth. That picture was the last thing Brielle had hung on the wall before Ruth moved in, and sometimes she wondered whether her grandmother still looked at it, and if she did, whether she knew who the girl in the photograph was. Ruth sat by the window, always by the window. Her eyes rested on the patch of grass outside, but she wasn't truly seeing anything. When Brielle walked in, Ruth turned, and every time she turned, Brielle had to swallow something down into her chest, because the eyes looking back at her were not the eyes of a woman recognizing her granddaughter. They were the polite eyes of an old woman looking at a stranger who had entered her room. Brielle sat beside her, took her hand, the wrinkled hand dry and rough and still warm, and Ruth would look at her, tilt her head, and say, "You remind me of someone I loved very much." Every time, the same sentence, the same gentle, faraway voice, as though she were speaking of someone from a dream she could no longer fully remember. And Brielle would smile, swallow back her tears, and say, "I love you too, Grandma." Every time, the same sentence, like a ritual, like a prayer she repeated not because she believed it would change anything, but because to stop repeating it would mean admitting that Ruth had truly lost her. Then Brielle drove back, and night fell, and in the attic room on the 3rd floor of the Moretti estate, another old woman needed her. Katerina often woke at 2 or 3 in the morning, not the ordinary kind of waking, but waking in panic, eyes wide in the dark, hand clutching the edge of the blanket, her mouth calling someone's name in Italian that Brielle couldn't understand. Brielle heard it through the thin wall between her own room and the attic room, and she would go in, open the door softly, sit beside the bed, take her hand, and sing under her breath, not an Italian song. She sang the song her mother used to sing to Ruth, an old lullaby with no name, and because she couldn't remember all the words, she sang the refrain over and over, and her voice was soft and unremarkable, but it was enough for Katerina's hand to slowly loosen from the blanket. On the nights when Katerina was clear, she told stories. She told Brielle about Declan as a boy, a little boy who had lost his mother before he was even 4 years old, whose father was a cold man who saw his son as an asset rather than a child, and only she, had been the one to hold him when he cried, to teach him how to tie his shoes, to cook him a hot bowl of pasta every night. "He is hard on the outside because he is soft on the inside. Ragazza," she said, her voice a whisper in the darkness of the attic room, like bark on a tree. The thicker the bark, the more fragile the tree inside. Brielle sat and listened, holding her hand, and remembered, not on paper, in herself, 2 old women, one in a nursing home 15 minutes away, who no longer remembered her granddaughter's name, one in a sweltering, freezing attic room, who only because of Brielle could still remember her grandson's name, and Brielle, 27 years old, eating 1 meal a day, sleeping 4 hours a night, was the only thread tying both of those old women to the world outside their rooms. That thread was very thin, and someone was trying to cut it. In the 4th year, Declan Moretti returned to the estate with a new scar along his left ribs and 3 weeks of mandatory leave that he refused to call leave. He called it time to handle things remotely. The Boston incident, that was what people in the house called it. No one said exactly what had happened, but Rafe came back with him and didn't leave the estate for the entire first week, and Brielle saw blood soaking through Declan's white shirt when he stepped through the back kitchen door on the night he returned. His footsteps still silent but slower than usual, and she knew that whatever had happened in Boston had come close to killing her employer. Brielle didn't ask. She didn't look for long. She lowered her head over the sink and kept washing dishes, because in that house she had already learned that seeing too much was the fastest way to become a problem. But that night, at 2 a.m, Declan walked through the second-floor hallway. He couldn't sleep. Nightmares from Boston had pulled him out of bed, and he moved through the darkness the way he always did when his mind refused to settle, barefoot on the cold wood floor, without turning on the lights. Then he saw the light. Not the hallway lights. Light spilling through the crack of the attic room door on the 3rd floor, pale yellow and trembling, like a desk lamp turned to its lowest setting. He went up the back staircase, pushed the door open, and he saw Brielle. She was sitting on a small wooden chair beside Katerina's bed, her back slightly bent because the ceiling was too low, an open book resting on her lap, reading in a quiet voice, steady and slow as breathing. Katerina had fallen asleep, but her hand was still wrapped tightly around Brielle's hand, holding on even in sleep, as though she feared that if she let go, the only person left who cared about her would disappear. Brielle didn't look up. She didn't know Declan was standing there. She simply kept reading, her voice so soft he had to hold his breath to hear it. And the tiny attic room was stifling even though dawn was close. The ceiling low, the bulb yellow, the bed narrow, the blanket thin. Declan stood in the doorway and looked at the room where his grandmother was sleeping, and something tightened in his chest, not because of the Boston wound, but because this was not a room for the grandmother of Moretti's boss. This was not a room fit even for an enemy. How long he stood there, Brielle never knew. When she finally looked up, the door was already closed, and the hallway outside was silent. She didn't know he had seen, but Declan had seen, and from that night on, he began to watch. Not the passing glance of 4 years earlier, the kind of glance people give a piece of furniture or a wall, knowing it is there without truly seeing it. This time Declan watched for real. He saw the way Brielle made tea for Katerina every morning, exactly the Italian way she liked it. Boiling water poured into the cup first, then the tea added after, stirred 3 turns counterclockwise, with 1 small spoonful of honey because she didn't take sugar. He saw the way she cut food into small pieces before setting the plate in front of the old woman, because Katerina's hands shook and larger pieces would fall from the spoon. He saw the way she moved through the house as though she took up no space, like someone who had trained herself to exist without making anyone feel inconvenienced, and he found himself wondering when she had begun to walk that lightly, and who had taught her that she needed to be invisible. Then came the dinner with business associates. Declan invited 4 associates from New York to the estate for dinner, the kind of dinner that in his world was never only about eating, but about measuring, probing, and shifting positions on the board. Brielle cooked from early morning and served that evening, moving between the dining room and the kitchen like a shadow in the gray uniform Portia had made her wear. In the middle of the meal, one of the guests, a woman named Bianca sitting beside Katerina, turned to Portia and remarked with genuine admiration, "Katerina looks remarkably well. Who takes care of her?" A broad smile, natural, practiced so perfectly that no one would have known it was false unless they had looked long enough. "I do," Portia said. "She's family. I make sure she's comfortable every day." Brielle was standing behind them, holding a silver tray of bread. She heard every word clearly, and all 10 of her fingers tightened around the edge of the tray until her knuckles went white. She said nothing. She turned, walked back into the kitchen, set the tray down, and stood there with both hands gripping the edge of the stone counter, eyes closed, breathing. When she opened her eyes, she picked up the tray and went back out to continue serving, her face expressionless, her footsteps light, invisible, exactly the way Portia wanted. But at the head of the table, Declan had seen it. He saw Brielle's fingers go white against the rim of the tray. He saw her turn away, and he saw Portia smiling. Declan began to watch Brielle, and that was the thing Portia feared most, not because of jealousy, but because it meant losing control. Portia noticed the change in Declan's eyes before Declan noticed it himself. She wasn't jealous. Portia Kensington had never loved Declan Moretti enough to be jealous, but she recognized that Declan's gaze had begun to rest on Brielle for longer than 1 second. And in Portia's world, 1 second was more than enough for a housemaid to become a threat. Not a romantic threat, a territorial one. This house was Portia's kingdom, and anyone who began to occupy space in the king's eyes, even if it was only a shadow passing down the hallway, had to be pushed to the edge. Portia started with money. One morning, she called Brielle into the sitting room and announced in a calm voice that the dependent health insurance plan would be cut, the reason being a family cost adjustment. Brielle stood there with her hands clasped in front of her stomach, and she felt the floor beneath her tilt. That insurance was why she was here, the only reason she had endured 4 years. Without it, the cost of Maple Grove for Ruth would fall directly onto her shoulders, $6,000 a month, and with a salary of $1,800 a week, after paying Maple Grove she would have about $300 left for everything else: gas, phone, clothes, and food. $300 a week in Connecticut, where a cup of coffee cost $5. Brielle stopped eating breakfast. Then she gave up lunch altogether. Only dinner remained, usually whatever was left after Katerina had finished eating. And sometimes Brielle would look at that last plate of rice, and then divide it again for Katerina because the old woman was still hungry, and that night Brielle would go to bed with an empty stomach. Then Portia cut time. Starting that week, Brielle was forbidden to stay in Katerina's room after 8 at night. "She is asleep. You don't need to be here." But Katerina didn't sleep at 8. She usually woke at 2 or 3 in the morning in a panic, and now when she woke, there was no one there. No Brielle's hand. No quiet singing voice. Only darkness and the low attic ceiling, and the sound of her calling someone's name in Italian with no one to hear. To make up for it, Portia began giving Katerina heavy doses of sedatives, the kind the family doctor had prescribed in a mild dose to help with sleep. But Portia doubled it, then tripled it, because the more Katerina slept, the quieter the house became, and Portia liked quiet. Katerina began sleeping 16, 17, 18 hours a day. When she was awake, she was sluggish, her eyes cloudy, her hands too weak to hold a spoon. Brielle watched her decline day by day and could do nothing, because if she opened her mouth, she would lose her job. And losing her job meant losing the insurance, and the insurance was already gone. But losing the job meant losing the paycheck too, and losing the paycheck meant losing Ruth. Then, Preston Kensington arrived. Portia's brother appeared at the estate on a Friday afternoon, driving a black Porsche, walking into the house through the front door as though he owned it. Preston was 33, tall, blonde hair slicked back, handsome in the way of a cologne advertisement, but his eyes were cold and always moving, the eyes of a man who was constantly searching for either an exit or another person's weak point, depending on which would be more useful. He had come to visit his sister, but Brielle overheard the argument in the first-floor sitting room through a half-open door. Preston talking about the wedding, about the deadline, about the $12 million debt to Carlucci that couldn't wait any longer, and Portia talking about Declan as though he were a check that needed to be signed. Not a man she was about to marry. Brielle didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. The Kensington family needed this marriage to survive, and Portia wasn't here for love. She was here because $12 million was hanging around her family's neck. Preston met Brielle for the first time in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, her back to the door, and when she turned around, he was already there, leaning against the frame, looking at her with eyes that took all her willpower not to step back from. He didn't look at her the way Portia did, with the look that measured rank. He looked at her like an object, measuring size, weighing value, and the chill that ran down Brielle's spine was a kind of chill she had never felt in 4 years in that house. That night, Brielle heard Preston say to Portia in the sitting room, "The little maid is pretty. Be careful, sis." Portia didn't laugh. And that was the first time Brielle had ever seen Portia not laugh at something someone said, because Preston had just pointed straight at the fear she was trying to crush. 1 week later, Preston found Brielle in the back service hallway near the kitchen. He walked straight up to her, stood so close that she had to tip her head back to look up at him, and said in a low, even voice, like a man reading an address off an envelope, "Maple Grove, room 214, Ruth Ashford." 82 years old. Alzheimer's. Brielle stopped breathing. If you say anything to Declan, Preston continued, about my sister, about Katerina, about anything happening in this house, I will have your grandmother moved out of Maple Grove overnight. And you know I can do it. Then he walked away. Brielle stood in the narrow hallway with her back against the wall, her legs shaking so badly she had to slide down and sit on the floor. Portia had chained her with money and time. Preston chained her with Ruth, 2 layers of chains. And Brielle stood in the middle with empty hands. But one more thing happened that week. One afternoon, Brielle was wiping down the first-floor hallway, and the door to Declan's study was open. She hadn't meant to look inside, but her eyes passed over the opening, and she saw this. Declan sitting behind the desk, an open file in front of him, and inside it a portrait photograph of a man Brielle didn't know, and that photograph had been crossed out with a red pen, a large X slashed over the man's face. Brielle froze in the hallway. Declan looked up. The two of them stared at each other through the half-open door. 1 second, 2 seconds. He closed the file, slowly, without hurry, his eyes still on hers, not threatening, not explaining, only looking, as though he were waiting to see what she would do with what she had just seen. Brielle lowered her head, kept wiping the floor, and walked past the study door as though nothing had happened. But she knew. She knew what a man's picture marked with a red X meant. She knew Declan Moretti wasn't a businessman. And now she was living in a house with Portia, who stripped away piece after piece of her life day by day, with Preston, who held Ruth in his hands like a hostage, and with Declan, whose open file held the photograph of a man marked with a red X. Portia, Preston, and now she knew Declan was dangerous too. 3 threats. And Brielle stood in the middle with empty hands. The dinner with the business associates ended at 10:30. The guests left. Declan walked the last one to the front door. Portia stood in the hallway, smiling and waving until the headlights of the final car disappeared beyond the iron gates. And then the smile dropped from her face as quickly as if someone had yanked a string. She turned, her heels striking the marble floor, and walked straight into the kitchen where Brielle was standing at the sink, her arms deep in soapy water, washing each gold-rimmed porcelain plate by hand, because Portia wouldn't allow the dishwasher to be used for that set. Brielle heard the heels before she saw Portia, and from the rhythm alone she knew the night would not end at the sink. I saw your face. Portia stood in the middle of the kitchen, both arms folded across her chest. Brielle didn't turn around. When Bianca asked who takes care of Katerina, Portia continued, her voice lower than usual. The kind of low Brielle had learned was more dangerous than when she spoke loudly. Did you think I didn't see it? Your face changed. Your hand tightened on the tray. Did you think you had the right to show expression in front of my guests? Brielle still didn't turn. I didn't show any expression, ma'am. That was the wrong sentence. Brielle knew it the moment it left her mouth, because in this house, contradicting Portia, no matter how correct it was always the wrong sentence. The sound of heels came closer, then the sound of metal, then the sound of sauce hitting the floor. Portia had lifted the pot of tomato sauce, still sitting on the stove. The one Brielle had started cooking at 5 that evening. Beef sauce simmered for 4 hours, and flung it onto the kitchen floor. The hot sauce splattered across the white tile, up the base of the cabinets, onto Brielle's pant legs, and across both her hands as she instinctively raised them to shield her face. Brielle sucked in a breath through her teeth. The sauce was no longer boiling, but it was still hot enough for the skin on her hands to redden at once, the kind of red she knew would blister within a few hours. Portia set the empty pot on the counter, gently, precisely, as if she had just placed a vase of flowers there. Clean it up. 2 words. Then she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her heels striking the marble floor in an even rhythm, growing fainter with distance. Brielle stood in the middle of the kitchen, red sauce spreading beneath her feet like blood, her hands burning, and she did what she always did. She took a rag, she knelt down, and she cleaned, her knees pressed into the wet tile, the hot sauce soaking through her pants, her right hand scrubbing the floor while the skin of her palms burned so badly she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out, and she wiped away every red streak from the white floor, every drop, every smear, as if she were erasing the last proof that what had just happened was real. Rafe Moretti walked into the kitchen just then. He had come for a bottle of water, a habit every night before bed, and he pushed the kitchen door open and saw this. Brielle kneeling on the floor, her knees in the sauce, her burned red hands clutching the rag, her back curved, and the kitchen looking as though someone had hurled an entire pot onto the ground. Rafe froze in the doorway. 34 years old, Declan's cousin, second in command in the organization. A man who had seen things that most ordinary people never saw and still managed to sleep at night. And yet now he stood in the kitchen doorway, and something hotter than the sauce on the floor rose in his chest. Brielle looked up. Her eyes met Rafe's, and she saw in his eyes the one thing she had not seen in anyone else's in that house in 4 years: anger on her behalf. Rafe said nothing then. He stepped inside, took the bottle of water, stepped back out, and Brielle kept cleaning. But 30 minutes later, when Brielle was walking down the service hallway behind the kitchen on her way back to her room, Rafe was waiting for her at the corner, his back against the wall, his arms folded, and when she passed him, he said, not loudly, not softly, only enough for the two of them to hear, "I am going to tell Declan." Brielle stopped, turned to look at him, and then she did something Rafe didn't expect. She grabbed his hand. Her 2 burned red hands closed around his wrist, and her eyes locked on his, not pleading in a weak way, but pleading like someone who had already calculated every angle and knew that the right choice and the good choice were not always the same thing. "Don't," she said. "If you tell him now, Portia will throw me out before he has time to do anything. And her brother," she said more quietly still, "her brother knows about my grandmother, knows where she is, knows the room number." Rafe looked at her. He understood. In the world he lived in, hostages were not a foreign concept, and when a 27-year-old woman told him that her grandmother was being used as one, he didn't need to hear anything more to know she was telling the truth. Rafe said nothing. He gently removed her hands from his wrist and nodded. One nod only. Then he walked away down the narrow hallway, and Brielle watched his shadow disappear around the corner, and she let out a breath for the first time in hours. But Rafe did not promise to stay silent forever. He promised to stay silent for now. And in his mind, as he climbed the stairs back to his room, he drew a line as clearly as one painted on the floor. If Portia kept tormenting Brielle alone, he would respect the game she was playing. But if Katerina was pulled into it, if his boss's grandmother, the woman who had held him when he was 3 years old, was ever placed in the same position as Brielle on that sauce-stained kitchen floor, then his promise to the brown-haired girl would end immediately. Rafe kept his promise to Brielle, but promises have expiration dates, and that one was drawing very near. 3 in the morning. Brielle sat on the concrete step outside the back kitchen door, the place she passed through every day when she entered the house from the rear. But at night, it became the only place on the estate where she could sit without breaking any of Portia's rules. She was wrapping her right hand in a wet cloth, cold water from the kitchen sink, a dish towel she had soaked, and wound around the hand that had been burning since 11 that night, and still hadn't eased. The skin had blistered in 3 places, 2 on the back of her hand and 1 at her wrist, exactly where the sauce had struck when Portia threw the pot. Brielle sat there with her back against the brick wall, her eyes on the dark stretch of yard where Caesar and Nero slept by the fence, and she felt the kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep, the kind that 10 hours of rest wouldn't touch because it lived deeper than bone and muscle. She heard the back door open before she saw who it was. Silent footsteps, but the kitchen hinge gave a faint creak, and Brielle knew there was only one person in the house who moved without making a sound. Declan stepped out onto the stoop in a black t-shirt and dark pants, barefoot, his hair slightly disordered like someone who had been lying in bed for hours without sleeping. The Boston nightmares. Brielle had heard Rafe tell the butler that Declan hadn't slept more than 3 straight hours since coming home. And every night he wandered through the house like a ghost. Like her, only the difference was that he walked because he couldn't sleep, and she walked because she wasn't allowed to use the main hallway. Declan saw her, stopped, looked down at the wet cloth wrapped around her hand. He didn't ask if she was all right in the polite way people do. He said, "That's not hot water. That's a burn." His voice was flat, neither rising nor falling, but his eyes stayed on the cloth around her hand longer than necessary, and Brielle knew he was reading that injury the way he read the files on his desk, looking for the story beneath the surface. Then he sat down, not across from her, beside her, on the same concrete step, his shoulder less than a hand's width from hers, and it was the first time in 4 years that Brielle had ever sat level with Declan Moretti, not with her standing while she served and him sitting while he received, but the two of them sitting on the same step, looking out into the same dark yard, both carrying wounds no one else in the house knew about. Brielle glanced sideways, not deliberately, and she saw on his wrist, where his sleeve had slid back when he braced his hand behind him, a long scar running from wrist to forearm, pale against his darker skin. Old, not from Boston, much older, and she remembered Katerina's voice in the dark attic room. The thicker the bark, the more fragile the tree inside. They sat there in silence for a while. Not long. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe 10. The kind of silence in which two people don't need to say anything because both understand that in the middle of the night, on a cold step, no one is obligated to fill the space with words. Then Declan said, without looking at her, his gaze fixed on the yard, "If something is wrong in this house, I need to know." Brielle felt those words settle on her chest like a stone. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to tell him about every room, about the sedatives, about the pot of sauce, about Preston and Maple Grove room, 214. But she thought of Portia, of Preston, of Ruth sitting by the window. And she said, "Nothing is wrong, sir. Good night." She stood up, went inside, didn't look back. Declan remained on the step alone. He didn't believe her, but he didn't yet know enough not to believe her. Sunday, Maple Grove. Brielle pushed open the door to room 214, and Ruth was sitting by the window as always, her eyes on the grass outside, her hands resting in her lap. When Brielle walked in, Ruth turned, looked at her, and Brielle prepared herself for the sentence she had heard hundreds of times, the sentence that still hurt like the first time every time she heard it, though she had learned how to swallow the pain before it reached her eyes. But today Ruth didn't say that sentence. She looked at Brielle, tilted her head, frowned slightly as if trying to remember something very far away, and then she said, "Are you the new nurse?" The other one was nicer. Brielle stood in the doorway. She didn't know which nurse Ruth meant, because there had been no nurse before her. Or perhaps in Ruth's mind there was some nurse from a memory mixed together with the present. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that today Ruth did not say, "You remind me of someone I loved very much." Today she looked at her own granddaughter and saw a stranger she didn't even like as much as the stranger before. Brielle smiled, said, "I'll try to do better, Grandma." She sat beside her for 2 hours, held her hand, then left. The Maple Grove parking lot, the 2007 Honda Civic. Brielle sat behind the wheel, closed the door, and lowered her face onto the steering wheel. She cried, without sound. Her shoulders shook, but her mouth never opened, the kind of crying she had trained herself to do over 4 years, because the walls at the Moretti estate were thin, and crying out loud was a luxury she wasn't allowed. She cried until she ran out of tissues. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a breath, and opened her phone, opened the job app, typed Housekeeper Jobs Connecticut. Her fingers trembled over the keys. The results came up. Lower wages, no insurance, and no position anywhere near Maple Grove. She scrolled, kept scrolling. Every listing was a doorway leading farther away from Ruth, farther than 15 minutes by car, farther from the Sunday ritual, and Brielle looked at those doorways and knew that stepping through any one of them would mean letting go of her grandmother's hand. She looked up. The second-floor window of the nursing home, Ruth's room. The yellow light was still on. Brielle looked at that light. Then she looked down at her phone, cleared the search bar, closed the app, slipped the phone back into her pocket, started the engine. She wasn't strong because she never wavered. She was strong because she wavered and still came back. But the next time she came back, she would discover something that made silence impossible. Brielle's suspicion began with Katerina's hands. The old woman had always trembled, but the tremor of old age is a light thing, coming in waves, still able to hold a spoon, still able to keep a teacup steady if someone placed it carefully into her hand. But 2 weeks after Portia forbade Brielle to remain in her room past 8 at night, Katerina's hands no longer trembled. They sagged. Her fingers went limp, as if there were no bones left inside them, the spoon slipping from her grasp, the instant Brielle placed it there, the teacup tipping into her lap before she could react, and her eyes, the same eyes that only 10 days earlier had lit up while telling stories about Declan as a boy, now looked clouded, like window glass filmed over with fog. Katerina slept 16 hours, then 17, then 18. When she was awake, she was sluggish, silent, unable to recognize Brielle, sitting on the bed staring at the wall, with the empty gaze of someone being pulled slowly downward into a place so deep no one could reach her there. One night, after Portia had gone to bed, Brielle slipped up to the attic room. She opened Katerina's bedside drawer, the one where Portia had been keeping the medicine box herself ever since she forbade Brielle to stay past 8. Brielle took out the bottle and read the label in the glow of her phone. A sedative, the kind the family doctor had prescribed in a mild dose to help an elderly woman sleep. The prescribed dose on the label was 1 pill before bed. Brielle counted the pills remaining in the bottle, checked them against the dispensing date printed on the cap, and her hand turned cold. Portia had been giving her 3 pills a day, 3 times the prescribed dose. Brielle sat on the attic floor with the bottle in her hand, and she understood that Katerina was not weakening because of age. She was being poisoned. Slowly. Every day. By the very woman who was about to become her granddaughter-in-law. Brielle began reducing the dose that same night. Every evening after Portia went to bed, she crept up to the attic and removed some of the medicine from the cup Portia had prepared for Katerina to take the next morning. On the first day, she removed 1 pill. By the 3rd day, she removed another half. She went slowly, because stopping a sedative too abruptly in an elderly person could cause seizures. And Brielle was not a doctor, but she had cared for the sick long enough to know that an 83-year-old body does not forgive haste. 10 days. 10 nights Brielle crept up to the attic room. 10 nights she held her breath moving through the forbidden hallway after 9. 10 times she heard herself swallow in the dark and wondered what would happen if Portia caught her. On the 10th day, Katerina woke changed. Her eyes were bright. Her back was straight. Her hand could hold a spoon without trembling. Brielle was sitting beside her bed at 6 in the morning, before Portia woke, and Katerina turned to look at her, looking straight at her, not through the dull fog of sedatives, but with the clear eyes of a woman who had spent 83 years seeing enough of the world to know exactly what was being done to her. She took Brielle's hand, held it tight, and she said, each word clear, her Italian-touched English voice not trembling at all, "That woman is poisoning me, ragazza. She wants me gone. Tell my grandson. Tell Declan." Brielle did not breathe for 3 seconds. Then she did the thing she had been thinking about for 10 nights in the attic. She pulled out her phone, pressed record, and asked Katerina to say it again. Katerina said it again, the same sentence, the same voice, clear, lucid, impossible to mistake for delirium. Brielle stopped the recording, locked the file, and hid it inside the folder with old photographs that no one would ever think to open. Her only card. She did not play it right away. She hid it, and waited. But Portia was not stupid. Portia realized Katerina was coming back when the old woman began refusing her morning pills, pushing Portia's hand away and saying no in a voice so clear it made Portia step back in surprise. Portia checked the bottle, counted the pills, and she knew. She knew someone had reduced the dose, and in that house, there was only one person who slipped up to the attic every night. But Portia did not punish Brielle directly. She had learned that Brielle could endure blows aimed at herself. She had thrown an entire pot of hot sauce at her, and Brielle had still knelt to clean it without making a sound. So this time Portia struck where Brielle could not endure it. Portia called Maple Grove Nursing Home, pretending to be a family relative, and ordered every level of service for Ruth Ashford in room 214. Reduced, specialist care cut off, rehabilitative therapy stopped, transfer to a smaller room. Brielle did not know until Sunday. She pushed open the door to room 214 and found it empty. The bed had been stripped. Her graduation photograph was gone from above the nightstand. Brielle stood in the middle of the empty room, her heart beating in her throat, and she ran into the hallway to ask the nurse. Mrs. Ashford was moved, the nurse said. First floor, room 103. Brielle ran downstairs. Room 103 was nearly half the size of the old room. It did not have a window facing the garden, only one looking directly at the parking lot. The warm yellow light was gone, replaced by cold white fluorescent light, and Ruth was sitting on the bed alone, with no one reading to her, no one speaking to her, her eyes fixed on the parking lot beyond the glass, with the expression of a woman who did not know where she was anymore, and no longer had the strength to ask. Brielle stood in the doorway of the new room, and for the first time in 5 years, she did not feel sorrow. She felt anger. Real anger. The kind that begins in the pit of the stomach, and rises into the chest and the throat, and burns so hot she could feel it behind her eyes, hotter than the sauce on the kitchen floor, hotter than summer concrete, so hot that if she opened her mouth now, she was afraid what came out would burn down everything she had built over 5 years. But Brielle did not open her mouth, because exploding now would mean losing. It would mean Portia won. It would mean Ruth would lose even room 103. It would mean the recording file on Brielle's phone would become worthless. Brielle swallowed the anger down. She swallowed it the way she swallowed bitter medicine. She forced it down into her chest, into her stomach, folded it into the smallest shape possible, and placed it beside the audio file in the folder with the old photographs. She waited, not because she was afraid, because exploding now would mean losing. But 2 weeks later, Portia would do something that made it unnecessary for Brielle to explode at all, because someone else would do it for her. And that is how we return to where the story began. 2 weeks after the day, Brielle stood in the doorway of room 103 and saw Ruth sitting alone in a smaller, darker room. Portia decided to host a weekend luncheon. 6 friends, the kind of women Brielle had grown used to watching for 4 years, the kind who wore gold crosses around their necks and treated servers like furniture. Brielle began cooking at 5 in the morning. Lunch lasted 2 hours. She served, cleared, poured wine, collected plates, and remained invisible in exactly the way Portia had trained her to be for 5 years. Then, when the meal ended and the 6 women were still sitting in the backyard sipping their 3rd glass of wine under the July sun, Portia did the thing she had been planning ever since she discovered that Brielle had been reducing the sedatives. She ordered Brielle to bring Katerina down to the yard, the scene you have already seen at the beginning of the story. Hot concrete, 2 plates of rice placed on the cement between the dogs' water bowls, Caesar and Nero lying there eating beside them. Katerina Moretti, 83 years old, sitting in a rusted garden chair, her hands trembling, rice falling onto her dress. Brielle kneeling on the concrete, her back straight, eating slowly, helping lift the spoon to Katerina's mouth. Portia filming the video and sending it to the group chat with 3 laughing emojis. 6 women standing around with wineglasses in hand, watching as if it were entertainment after lunch. You already know that scene. You have already seen it. So we will not stay there. We are going upstairs. Rafe Moretti was standing at the bedroom window on the 2nd floor, the one looking straight down onto the backyard. He had no particular reason to be looking outside, perhaps only the habit of a man who checked every angle of any space he occupied, the habit that 10 years as Declan's second in command had turned into instinct. He looked down and he saw it. He saw the concrete. He saw the 2 dogs. He saw Katerina trembling in the rusted chair. He saw Brielle kneeling. He saw the 6 women laughing. And he saw Portia standing in the back doorway with a phone in her hand, recording it. Rafe stood there for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the line he had drawn in his own mind that night, in the service hallway behind the kitchen, shattered like glass. Brielle had asked him not to speak. He had nodded. But that promise came with a condition. If Katerina was dragged into it, he would not keep it. And Katerina was sitting in the backyard eating rice beside the dogs. His boss's grandmother. The woman who had held him when he was 3 years old, cooked pasta for him every night, taught him to read in Italian before he could read in English. She was sitting in a rusted chair beneath the sun, trembling, while someone recorded it to send to friends for their amusement. Rafe did not call. He did not text. He stepped away from the window, went out into the hallway, walked straight to the back staircase at the far end of the 2nd floor, the staircase that led down to the basement, where Portia had never set foot because she did not know it existed, or knew and had never cared enough to ask what it was for. The basement of the Moretti estate was not a wine cellar or a game room. It was the meeting room, Declan's real office, where calls took place that no one else in the house ever heard, where files with photographs marked by red X's were opened and closed again. Rafe pushed the door open. Declan was sitting behind the desk with financial files spread out in front of him, a pen in his hand, the desk lamp casting light across his face and leaving shadows in the hollows beneath his eyes that made him look older than 36. Rafe said, "You need to come upstairs, right now." Declan looked up. He looked at Rafe. 10 years of working together. 10 years of Rafe standing behind him in every dangerous room from New York to Boston to Philadelphia. And in those 10 years, Declan had heard every register in Rafe's voice. Calm, tense, angry, afraid, cold. But the voice he had just heard was one he had never heard before. That voice had no name. It was the thing that exists between horror and fury, the place where language has not yet found a word. What happened? Just come. Declan set down the pen, stood up, followed Rafe up the stairs. The old wooden staircase creaked beneath every step, and Rafe began telling him as they climbed, his voice low and fast, only enough for the 2 of them to hear. Katerina in the yard. Concrete. Dogs. plates of food on the ground, 6 women, Portia filming it. With every step Declan took upward, with every detail Rafe gave him, the air around him thickened a little more, like a man walking into deep water, where each step raises the level another inch. Through the first-floor hallway, through the kitchen, the smell of the food Brielle had been cooking since 5 that morning still clung to the walls. To the back door. Declan stopped in the doorway, and he saw everything. Katerina in the rusted chair, her eyes red, the plate of rice on her lap, her hands shaking, grains falling onto her dress. Brielle anchored to the rough pavement beside the 2 dogs, her spine as rigid as oak, eating slowly, her face expressionless as though she had trained herself to shut everything down inside in order to survive moments that would have broken any ordinary person. And Portia, standing 3 yards away with a phone in her hand, the last trace of a smile still caught at the corner of her mouth. Declan's jaw tightened. The tendons in his neck stood out. His hands hanging at his sides slowly curled into fists, steadily, deliberately, the kind of fists made not from losing control but from forcing every ounce of control into 10 fingers, so that the rest of the body would not do the thing it wanted to do. The 6 women in the yard saw him before Portia did. Their smiles vanished, their wine glasses lowered. The air froze as if someone had pulled all the oxygen out of the yard. Portia felt the shift, turned, and saw Declan standing in the back doorway. "Declan," she said, and her voice had gone so thin it was nearly transparent. "You're home early. Nana." Declan did not look at Portia. He looked at Katerina, and his voice cracked. Only once. A single fracture in the concrete wall he had built around himself for 36 years. Then he swallowed it back down. "Get up, Nana. Brielle, both of you. Inside, now." Brielle's eyes met Declan's. And in that look, she did not see anger. She saw pain. The kind of pain a man feels when he realizes he has failed in the one place that mattered most. He had been right downstairs, 1 floor away, and he had not known. Declan stepped out into the yard, helped Katerina rise from the rusted chair, one hand holding hers, the other at her back, and led her into the house. Not through the back kitchen door, not through the side entrance. He led her through the hall, past the dining room, through the foyer, and straight through the front door. The heavy oak door Brielle had not walked through in 5 years, as if with every step he was declaring that his grandmother would enter this house by the path she deserved. He settled her onto the sofa in the first-floor sitting room, the room that had been taken from her when Portia moved her up to the attic. And he pulled a light blanket over her knees, and Katerina looked at her grandson with red eyes but did not cry, because she had told Brielle she had forgotten how to cry. Though Brielle thought perhaps she had not forgotten, perhaps she was only saving her tears for another time. Portia's 6 friends disappeared while Declan was bringing Katerina inside. They slipped out one by one, no one saying goodbye, no one looking back, like rats running from a room when the lights come on. When Declan returned to the sitting room, only Portia was left standing in the middle of it, and Brielle was standing in the hallway with her back against the wall, her hands still marked with dust from the backyard concrete. Declan looked at Portia. He didn't shout. He didn't slam a hand on the table. His voice was low, even, controlled to the point that every word sounded weighed before it left his mouth. "You made my grandmother eat outside with the dogs." Portia opened her mouth. "Declan, let me explain. She needed fresh air, and I thought, don't. One word." And Portia's mouth closed, as if that single word had physical weight pressing her jaw shut. Declan turned to Brielle. For the first time, he looked at her not through a half-open doorway or in passing through a hallway or from the head of a dinner table. He looked directly into her eyes, and he asked 2 words. "How long?" Brielle looked at Portia, looked back at Declan, and she knew that this moment, the one she had been waiting for and dreading at the same time for 5 years, had arrived. She opened her mouth, and she told him. Everything. Every room. The front door forbidden from the first week. The kitchen. The sauce thrown out. The meals she was ordered to cook again. The tiny attic room. Hot in summer and freezing in winter. The portable toilet in the tool shed. Katerina's portions cut down. The hallway forbidden after 9 at night. The insurance taken away. The sedatives tripled. Preston threatening Ruth at Maple Grove in room 214. Ruth's services downgraded. Her room changed. 5 years. Every day. Not a single day spared. Brielle spoke in an even voice, without trembling, without crying, like someone reading an inventory of damage after a storm, line by line, item by item, precise and cold, because if she let emotion into her voice, she would never be able to finish. Portia stood in the middle of the room, her face growing whiter and whiter. Each detail Brielle spoke, draining another layer of color from her skin. And twice she opened her mouth to speak, but both times no sound came out. Then Brielle took out her phone, opened the folder with the old photographs, pressed play. Katerina's voice filled the sitting room, clear, lucid, each word distinct. "That woman is poisoning me, Ragazza. She wants me gone. Tell my grandson. Tell Declan." Silence. The kind of silence in which Brielle could hear her own heartbeat. Declan looked at Portia. "Get out. You have 1 hour." Portia lunged toward him. "The wedding. Declan. My family. You can't just... Your family." Declan repeated the words, his voice colder by a degree. "We'll get to your family." Portia stood there for another 3 seconds, mouth open, her eyes searching Declan's face for something she could still hold on to, but finding nothing except stone. Then she turned and went upstairs. This time the sound of her heels on the staircase was uneven, stumbling, like someone who had forgotten how to walk. Declan remained standing in the middle of the sitting room for 10 seconds after Portia disappeared at the top of the stairs. Then he went into the study, closed the door. Rafe and Brielle stood in the hallway looking at the closed door, and 3 seconds later they heard glass break. Not a great crashing sound, a sharp, clean crack, like a fist driven into something flat and hard. Rafe stepped forward and opened the study door. Declan was standing before the large mirror hanging on the wall opposite his desk, his right hand bleeding, the blood dripping onto the wood floor, and the mirror was fractured outward from the point of impact like a spider web, reflecting his face in dozens of warped shards. "I run an empire, Rafe." Declan's voice was not loud, lower even than when he had spoken to Portia, so low that Rafe had to step closer to hear him. "I control half the eastern seaboard, and I couldn't protect an 83-year-old woman in my own house." Rafe said nothing, because there was nothing to say. "How many times, Rafe?" Declan turned to look at his cousin. Blood from his hand dripped onto the broken glass on the floor. "How many times did this happen while I was downstairs? While I was in the next room? I don't know. December I only saw today." Silence. Long. Heavy. Declan sank into the chair, resting his head in the hand that was still bleeding, blood smearing across his forehead and into his hair. And in that moment, the man who controlled half the Northeast looked like the motherless little boy Katerina had once described to Brielle in the dark attic room. Then he lifted his head. His eyes changed. The pain receded, and what replaced it was colder, sharper, the kind of cold Brielle had glimpsed once through the crack of the study door on the day he closed the file with the photograph marked by a red X. "Mafia instinct. Investigate her," Declan said to Rafe. "Brielle Ashford. Background, finances, past, everything. I want to know who she is before I believe anything she just said." Rafe nodded. "And the video," Declan continued. "Portia recorded it and sent it to the group chat. Recover it from every phone, all of them. Erase every trace. Keep one copy only." The Mafia boss fell apart and stood back up in the same night, but Brielle Ashford's file, when it landed on his desk 24 hours later, would make him fall apart a second time, in an entirely different way. 24 hours later, Rafe laid the file on the study desk, exactly where the night before blood from Declan's hand had dripped and been wiped away, though the wood there was still a shade darker than the surface around it. Declan sat behind the desk, his right hand wrapped in white bandage, the shattered mirror already removed, but the wall still holding the nail and the pale rectangular mark where the mirror had once hung. He opened the file. First page, Brielle Ashford, 27 years old, born in Burlington, Vermont. Father Thomas Ashford, carpenter, died when she was 14, workplace accident. Mother Linda Ashford, nurse, died when she was 19, lung cancer. Dropped out of the University of Vermont in her second year. No degree, no assets, no real estate, no vehicle except a 2007 Honda Civic, with an estimated market value of less than $2,000. Second page, finances, Chase bank account, Greenwich branch, current balance, $340. Declan read that number twice. $340. She lived in Connecticut, one of the most expensive states in America, and the total amount in her bank account was $340. Income, $1,800 a week from the Moretti family. Expenses, $1,500 a week, sent directly to Maple Grove Nursing Home for the care of Ruth Ashford, room 214, later, room 103. Total cost $6,000 a month, remaining $300 a week for gas, phone, clothes, personal necessities, and food. $300 a week in Connecticut. Third page, family. Grandmother Ruth Ashford, 82 years old, mid-stage Alzheimer's, Maple Grove Nursing Home. No one else. No siblings, no relatives, no close friends in her contacts, other than the nursing home and the Moretti estate. No criminal record. No bad debt. No ties to any organization, gang, or suspicious individual. Rafe stood across the desk, his arms folded, watching Declan read. When Declan reached the last page and stopped, Rafe said, "She's clean. December clean to the point of heartbreak. She lives on $300 a week in Connecticut. Eats one meal a day, gives half of it to your grandmother. Sometimes she eats nothing. 5 years. Silence. She isn't a spy. She doesn't belong to anyone. She's just a 27-year-old woman trying to keep her grandmother alive with everything she has. And everything she has is $340. Declan looked at the file. He didn't look at Rafe. He looked at the number 340 on the financial page. And he thought about the woman who had knelt on scorching concrete beside 2 dogs, so his grandmother wouldn't be afraid. The woman who had shared her own food with Katerina for 3 years while eating 1 meal a day herself. The woman who had slipped into the attic every night to reduce the sedatives and save his grandmother from being poisoned. And that woman had $340 in her bank account after 5 years of work, without a single day off except Sunday afternoon. He closed the file. Slowly. Rested both hands on the cover. Silent for a while. The kind of silence Rafe knew better than to interrupt. Then Declan said, "The grandmother. Maple Grove. Handle everything. Best room. Private doctor. 24-hour care. No name. Anonymous." Rafe nodded. But before turning away, he stopped. No signature? Declan didn't look up. No name. Declan Moretti had never done anything without signing his name to it. In his world, a name was power. A name was a mark. A name was the way he told the world that this thing belonged to him, and anyone who touched it would pay for it. This was the first time he had done something without wanting anyone to know. He stood behind it, and that was the first sign. 1 week later, Preston Kensington drove his black Porsche through the iron gates of the Moretti estate for the last time, though at that moment he did not yet know it would be the last. He entered through the front door, as he always did, shoulders straight, chin lifted, carrying the confidence of a man who still believed he held the stronger hand. Declan was waiting for him in the study, seated behind the desk, his right hand still wrapped in white bandage, the wall opposite left bare where the mirror had once hung. Rafe stood by the door, arms folded across his chest, his back against the wall, his face unreadable. Preston sat down in the chair across from Declan without being invited, crossed one leg over the other, and began in the tone he believed sounded like negotiation, but was in truth only begging wrapped in arrogance. "If you break the engagement, the Kensington family will withdraw every bit of support. Everything. Every connection. You need us, Declan." Declan looked at Preston, not with the look of someone measuring him, with the look of someone who had measured him long ago and was now waiting for him to finish his part before bringing the curtain down. "The $12 million debt your family owes Carlucci in Philadelphia," Declan said, his voice as flat as the desktop. "I bought that debt 3 months ago. You don't owe Carlucci anymore. You owe me." Preston did not go pale. He smiled, a broad, confident smile, the kind a man wears when he has just been struck but still thinks he is wearing armor. "You think I came here without a card to play?" Preston leaned forward. "I sent the full details of Moretti Holdings' underground operations to an investigative reporter at the New York Times. He's sitting on a 30-page article right now. My insurance policy. If I don't call him every 72 hours, it goes to the front page." Silence. Rafe frowned, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, the smallest possible sign that he was reassessing the situation. Preston leaned back and smiled wider. He thought he had just laid down the one card Declan had no answer for. Declan was silent. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Then he opened the desk drawer on the right and took out a phone. Not his phone. Preston's. Or more precisely, its clone, a perfect duplicate Rafe, had made the first time Preston brought the device onto the estate, because in Declan Moretti's house, No electronic device passed through the iron gates, without Rafe knowing what it contained. Declan placed the phone on the desk with the screen turned toward Preston. "Your reporter," Declan said. "Jeffrey Crane, the New York Times. You sent him 17 emails over the past 2 months. I have all of them." Preston was no longer smiling. This morning, Jeffrey Crane accepted an offer from the Boston Herald. Double the salary, senior editor position. The Boston Herald is owned by a media group run by an old friend of mine. Declan paused. The article is never running. Preston looked at the phone on the desk, then back at Declan. And this time, he went pale. The kind of pale that cannot be faked. The kind that drains a man's face in a single heartbeat and does not come back. 90 days, Declan said. Pay the 12 million. You know the rest. He did not explain what the rest meant. In this world, the rest did not need explaining. Preston stood up, looked at Rafe by the door, looked back at Declan. Then he turned and walked out, and for the first time, Preston Kensington's steps were unsteady on the marble floor. That same day, in the afternoon, Portia returned to the estate to collect the rest of her things. She arrived in a taxi, no longer driven by Preston's Porsche, and she entered through the front door for the last time with 2 suitcases and eyes red from crying, hidden behind dark glasses. Brielle was standing in the first-floor hallway when Portia rolled her luggage past. Not the service hallway behind the kitchen. The main hallway. The hallway Brielle had been forbidden to walk through after 9 at night for 3 years. Portia saw Brielle and tried to pass without looking at her, but Brielle did not step aside. She stood there, in the middle of the hallway, looking straight at her. "I took care of your fiancé's grandmother for 5 years." Brielle's voice was not loud. She did not shout. It did not shake. It was the voice of someone who had held these words in her chest for 5 years, and was now letting them out, one by one, carefully, precisely, because each word deserved to be heard clearly. "I held her when she cried at 2 in the morning because she thought no one remembered her. I cut her food into small pieces because her hands shook. I read to her every night until she fell asleep, and you locked her in the attic and poisoned her." Brielle stopped. "Let each word fall onto the marble floor and stay there. Every time you kneel down to scrub a floor yourself," Brielle said, "and you will kneel, I know you will think of me, not because I am cursing you, but because at last you will understand what it costs." Portia stood there with one hand gripping the suitcase handle, the dark glasses unable to hide the tears sliding down both sides of her nose. She said nothing, because for the first time in 5 years, she had nothing to say. Portia pulled the suitcase past Brielle, out the front door, down the steps, into the taxi, gone, and Brielle stood there, in the middle of the main hallway. Then she walked, not toward the kitchen, not into the service corridor. She walked straight through the sitting room, across the foyer, and out the front door. The heavy oak door. She placed her hand on the handle, pushed, and stepped onto the stone front steps. The afternoon sun of Greenwich touched her face. The July wind lifted her hair back from her shoulders. The 2 Neapolitan mastiffs lay at the foot of the steps and looked up at her lazily. And Brielle stood there, on the front steps of the house she had lived in for 5 years and never once walked out through this door. And she breathed, deeply. For the first time in 5 years, no one was telling her where she had to stand. Sunday. Brielle drove to Maple Grove by the same road, through the same intersection, and parked in the same place in the lot. But when she entered the building and gave Ruth Ashford's name, the nurse at the front desk smiled and said, "Mrs. Ashford has been moved. 3rd floor, room 302, special care wing." Brielle stood at the desk, frowning. The 3rd floor was for patients with premium insurance or private pay, a wing Brielle had never once stepped into because it had always been beyond the reach of $300 a week. She went up the stairs, down the 3rd floor hallway where the floor was carpeted instead of covered in vinyl tile, where the lights were warm yellow instead of harsh fluorescent white, and she stopped in front of room 302. The door was open, and Brielle stood there with one hand on the frame, looking into a room she could hardly believe was real. It was 3 times the size of the old one. A wide window looked out over the garden, and the Sunday afternoon light poured all the way to the foot of the bed. A new bed. White sheets. A soft blanket. Above the bed, her high school graduation photograph had been placed back in exactly the right spot, at exactly the same slight angle Brielle had hung it the first time in room 214. Beside the bed, a middle-aged woman in pale blue scrubs sat reading aloud to Ruth in a slow, gentle voice. And Ruth was sitting in the chair by the window with a cup of tea in her hands, a real porcelain cup instead of a plastic one, and on the little table beside her chair was a vase of fresh flowers someone had set there not long before Brielle arrived. "Who is paying for all this?" Brielle asked the nurse at the third-floor desk when she came back out. "Anonymous, ma'am. They asked for the best room, a private doctor, 24-hour care, and no name attached." Brielle knew. She didn't need to hear another word to know who in this world would pay for Ruth and leave no name behind. There was only one person, and that person had his right hand wrapped in white bandage because he had punched through a mirror in his study. But Brielle did not know what had happened at Maple Grove the day before. Saturday. Declan Moretti drove to the nursing home alone. No Rafe, no bodyguards. His usual black jacket replaced by a simple light gray shirt, plain enough to make him look like an ordinary man if you did not look into his eyes. He went up to the third floor, to room 302, that Rafe had arranged the day before, and he stepped inside. Ruth was sitting by the window, looking out at the garden, her hands resting in her lap. When he entered, she turned and looked at him, and of course she did not recognize him. She had no idea who he was, had never met him, but she looked at him with the same polite expression she gave every stranger who came into her room. "Are you the plumber?" she asked. "The bathroom faucet is leaking." Declan looked at the 82-year-old woman sitting in the chair, silver-haired, narrow-handed, looking at him without knowing who he was, and he thought of Brielle, the woman who drove 15 minutes every Sunday to sit here and hold her hand and hear her say, "You remind me of someone I loved very much," and then swallow her tears and answer, "I love you too, Grandma." Every time, the same sentence, like a ritual. He sat down in the chair beside her, said nothing. Ruth looked at him, tilted her head, frowned a little, the way people with Alzheimer's sometimes do when something brushes against a part of the mind they have not completely lost. Not memory exactly, but a dim feeling that the person before them is not entirely a stranger, even if they do not know why. Then Ruth reached out and took his hand. Her hand was small, wrinkled, dry, and warm, and she held his hand the way she held Brielle's every Sunday, with the grip of someone who cannot remember your name but still remembers that a hand is meant to be held. And she said, her voice gentle and slow, each word dropping into the quiet room, "You look like someone who needs to be loved but doesn't know how to ask." Declan went still. His hand inside Ruth's did not move. That sentence, spoken by an old woman who could no longer remember her own granddaughter's name, struck the one place that 36 years of building concrete walls around himself had never managed to cover, the place his entire empire could not reach. Because no one said things like that to Declan Moretti. No one came close enough to say them. And no one who knew who he was could ever be free enough to tell the truth. Only an old woman with Alzheimer's who did not know what kind of boss he was, did not know what he controlled, did not know and did not need to know, who simply looked at him with eyes that had forgotten almost everything, and yet still remembered how to read loneliness in another person's face. Declan sat there for another 20 minutes, saying nothing, only letting Ruth hold his hand. Then he stood, gently eased his hand out of hers, and left. Sunday night. Brielle found Declan in the study. The door was open. The desk lamp was on. He was sitting behind the desk but not doing anything, only sitting there. And when Brielle stopped in the doorway, he looked up, and she saw that his eyes were different, not colder or warmer, but more tired. The kind of tired that belongs to someone who has just felt something too large to handle in the usual way. "Why did you do it?" Brielle asked. She did not say thank you. She asked why, because she needed to understand. Because in 5 years of living in that house, no one had ever done anything for her without a reason, and she needed to know his reason before she allowed herself to trust it. "Because you took care of my grandmother when no one else did. I don't need you to repay me." "I know." Declan looked at her. "That's why I did it." Silence. Brielle looked at his hand, the white bandage, the wound from the shattered mirror, and she remembered that night, the sound of glass breaking behind the study door, his voice telling Rafe, "I couldn't protect an 83-year-old woman in my own house." He was carrying a wound, too. A different kind, but still because of Katerina. Still because he had failed in the place that mattered most. For the first time, Brielle did not look at Declan as her employer. She looked at him as a person carrying something too heavy alone. And that was the moment everything began to change, or should have changed, until she discovered what he had done behind her back. Rafe was the one who let it slip, though not out of carelessness, only because he assumed Brielle already knew. Because in Rafe's mind, Declan having someone investigated was as natural as breathing, and he failed to understand that to Brielle it was nothing of the kind. He mentioned it in passing while the two of them were standing in the kitchen, Brielle washing dishes and Rafe waiting for the water to boil for coffee. One short sentence without intent. "Your file was the cleanest one Deck has ever read." Brielle stopped moving. Water kept running through her fingers from the tap. "What file?" she asked. Rafe looked at her, and he knew he had made a mistake. Brielle turned off the water, dried her hands on a towel, walked out of the kitchen, went straight to the study. She did not knock. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. And Declan looked up from his desk, and in the half-second before he could read the expression on her face, he saw something he had never seen in Brielle Ashford in all 4 years. Anger. Not the kind she had swallowed 1,000 times, the kind folded up and hidden in her chest. The kind that stands with unyielding dignity and looks you in the eye. "You had me investigated." It was not a question. It was a statement. Declan did not deny it. "I investigate everyone in this house. I knelt on hot concrete beside 2 dogs so your grandmother would not have to kneel there alone." Brielle's voice did not shake. It was sharp, the kind of sharpness Declan recognized because he used it every day. The sharpness of a person who chooses every word the way another person chooses a knife. "I gave my food to your grandmother for 3 years. I slipped into the attic every night and cut back the sedatives to save her. And your response was to investigate my background?" "In my world," Declan said, his voice flat, though his eyes were not flat. His eyes were reading her the way he read a dangerous situation. He did not yet know how to escape. "Trusting someone without checking first is how you die, Brielle." "Your world." Brielle repeated the words, and those 2 words carried something more bitter than anger. "The world where you control everything except what happens inside your own house." That landed where it hurt. Brielle saw that it had landed because Declan's jaw tightened. The tendons in his neck stood out, and he looked at her the way people look when someone has spoken aloud, the very thing they tell themselves at 2 in the morning, but no one else has ever dared to say in daylight. He did not answer. Because she was right, and Declan Moretti did not argue with what he knew to be true. Then Brielle saw it. On his desk, his phone was open, and she glanced at the screen just long enough to recognize a frame she knew at once. The concrete yard, the sunlight, the 2 dogs, a young woman kneeling, the video, the one Portia had recorded and sent to the group chat that day. And Declan had kept a copy. "You kept that video?" Brielle's voice dropped, no longer sharp, colder now, the kind of cold Declan had used with Preston a week earlier. "The video of me kneeling on the concrete beside the dogs? For what? Evidence? Leverage? A weapon in a drawer in case you ever needed it?" "To protect you," Declan said. "If Portia or Preston ever came back, delete it." Brielle cut him off. Her voice was no longer cold. It was quiet, the kind of quiet more frightening than shouting. "I do not need evidence of that day. I remember it clearly enough. I remember the heat of the concrete under my knees. I remember Katerina's hand shaking while I helped the spoon to her mouth. I remember the sound of Portia laughing. I do not need a video file to remember. Delete it." Declan looked at her. For a long moment. Then he picked up the phone, opened the file, pressed delete. The screen showed one word: deleted. He set the phone back on the desk, the screen facing her. Brielle looked at it, nodded, turned, walked to the door, and she closed the study door. Gently, deliberately. The kind of door closing Declan knew was worse than slamming, because slamming is loss of control, while closing it softly means total control and still choosing to leave. 4 days. 4 days in which Brielle and Declan lived under the same roof without speaking a single word. Brielle cared for Katerina in the first-floor sitting room, where she had been moved back after 5 years in the attic. Declan stayed in the study, or the basement. The 2 of them avoided each other in the hallways like planets thrown out of orbit, close enough to feel each other's pull, never touching. On the 4th day, Katerina called Declan into the room. She was sitting upright on the sofa in the sitting room, her eyes bright, her hands resting on her lap. And when Declan sat beside her, she took his hand in both of her small, warm hands that still trembled slightly, and she said, "You were right to check. I understand. In your world, trusting without checking gets you killed." Declan looked at her. "But you were wrong," she went on, "when you did not tell her first. You checked behind her back, You kept the video behind her back. You did everything behind her back because that is how you are used to living, because your world taught you that secrets are weapons." She paused, looked at him with 83 years in her eyes. "But in love, Declan, secrets are not weapons. Secrets are poison." Declan said nothing. Katerina looked at him a moment longer, then spoke again, her voice softer now but heavier than everything that had come before. "I have been poisoned enough to know what poison looks like." The sentence hung there between them, the literal meaning. The sedatives Portia had been feeding her for months. The deeper meaning. Secrets kill a relationship from the inside. Slowly, silently, in exactly the same way the sedatives had been killing her. One pill at a time, until a person forgets she was ever lucid at all. Declan sat in silence, because she was right. And because for the first time, the Moretti boss did not know how to repair the thing he had broken. But on the morning of the 5th day, he would try. With a pan of burned eggs, 5 in the morning, on the 5th day, Brielle went down to the kitchen as she always did, barefoot on the cold tile floor, her eyes not yet fully open, reaching up to the shelf for the tea tin to make Katerina's tea before the old woman woke. But when she pushed open the kitchen door, she stopped, because someone was already there. Declan Moretti stood at the gas stove with his back to the door, black t-shirt, dark pants, barefoot just like her, his right hand still wrapped in white bandage, and that hand was holding a non-stick skillet at an angle he clearly had no idea how to manage. On the stove, 2 eggs had already burned black in the pan. The whites turned into a brown rubbery layer stuck fast to the bottom, and a 3rd egg had been cracked badly, half of it spilled across the counter, the yolk running down the edge of the cabinet and onto the floor. The smell of burning hit Brielle before she fully registered the smoke. The whole kitchen, which she had kept spotless for 5 years, looked as though it had just survived a battle in which the eggs were the only casualties, and Declan Moretti, the man who controlled half the underworld of the Northeast, he was standing in the middle of that wreckage with the expression of someone facing an enemy he did not know how to defeat. "What are you doing?" Brielle asked from the kitchen doorway. Declan did not turn around. "Making breakfast. For her. For you. You are setting your own kitchen on fire. Then help me." 3 words. Then help me. Not an order. Not a polite request. A confession wrapped in the shortest 3 words Declan Moretti could manage. That he did not know how to do this. That he needed her. And that this was the only way he knew how to say "I am sorry," when he had never learned how to say those words aloud. He had burned eggs at 5 in the morning because eggs were the simplest thing he could think of making, and he had still ruined them, and he was still standing here, in the middle of smoke and charred eggs and yolk running across the floor, because walking away would mean admitting he did not know how to repair what he had broken, and Declan Moretti did not walk away. The burnt eggs smoked between them. 4 days of silence hung in the air heavier than the smoke. Brielle looked at his back, at the bandaged hand holding the pan, at the broken egg on the counter, and she did not say "I forgive you." She did not forgive him. Not yet. But she stepped forward. She crossed the kitchen floor, avoiding the pool of yolk on the tile, came to his side, turned off the gas, opened the window to let the smoke out, took the burned pan from his hand and set it in the sink, then opened the cabinet, took out a clean pan, set it on the stove, turned the flame low, and looked at him. "Crack the eggs into a bowl first," she said. "Don't crack them straight into the pan. Tap them lightly on the rim of the bowl, don't slam them. And low heat, not the highest flame you've got." She placed an egg in his hand. Her hand touched his, touched the white bandage, and both of them noticed that moment, but neither said a word. Declan tapped the egg against the bowl. The first time, too hard, bits of shell falling in. Brielle picked the shell out, lighter. The second time, he tapped more gently, and the egg split cleanly, the yolk dropping whole into the bowl. He looked at the egg with an expression Rafe would never have believed if he had seen it. Declan Moretti pleased with himself for successfully cracking an egg. Katerina came downstairs 10 minutes later. She walked down on her own, no one helping her, her back straight, her eyes bright, and when she stopped in the kitchen doorway, she saw her grandson holding a pan, while Brielle held his hand and adjusted the angle so the eggs would not slide to one side. The 2 of them standing together at the stove in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the first ruined batch, and she smiled. The first smile Brielle had seen on her face since the day she had been brought down from the attic. Katerina said softly, in Italian, 1 word, "Finalmente." Finally. that night, the back porch. The same concrete step where Brielle had once sat alone at 3 a.m. wrapping her burned hand. The same step where Declan had sat beside her for the first time. But this time he sat closer. Their shoulders almost touched. And this time he spoke. "You were right," he said, looking out at the dark yard where Caesar and Nero slept by the fence. "I control everything except the things that mattered most. I did not know my grandmother was being poisoned in my own house. I did not know you were eating 1 meal a day. I did not know you existed, really existed, for 5 years." Silence. "I am not good at apologizing. Never had to apologize to anyone. But you," he paused, swallowed, "you deserved more than anyone I have ever met. I do not need you to be perfect, Declan." Brielle said his name for the first time instead of Sir or Mr. "I just need you to see me. To see Katerina. To see what matters without needing Rafe to make you look." "I see now," he said quietly. "I see you." He placed his hand on top of hers, not holding it, just resting it there, asking with touch instead of words, "Is this all right?" Brielle did not pull away. She turned her hand over so her palm opened upward. And that palm, calloused, marked by the burn from the hot sauce, cracked from 5 years of cleaning chemicals, met his palm, the one with the old scar at the wrist, the fresh mirror wound under white bandage, the hard knuckles shaped by years he had never spoken about to anyone. 2 hands carrying different kinds of wounds, but born of the same source. Loving someone so much that pain became a price willingly paid. "The eggs you made this morning were terrible," Brielle said. And Declan laughed, the first real laugh Brielle had ever heard from him. Not the polite laugh he used with business associates, not the cold laugh he gave to enemies. A real laugh, the kind that began deep in the chest, and spread into the shoulders, and shook through the whole body, and loosened everything that had been held too tightly inside for too long. And in that laugh, Brielle heard something the underworld had never heard before. Declan Moretti was happy. 6 months later, the Moretti estate was still the same gray stone mansion, with 12 bedrooms behind its wrought iron gates, still bordered by sharply trimmed evergreen hedges, still fronted by the stone path leading to the heavy oak door. But the sound had changed. Once, the house had been silent like a tomb, the kind of silence in which footsteps echoed across the marble floors like voices inside an empty church. Now, from the first-floor sitting room, Katerina's laughter carried out, not a small laugh, but a real one, deep and full, the kind Brielle had never heard in those first 4 years, because the sedatives had stolen it from her. From the kitchen came Italian music playing on the little radio Katerina had told Rafe to buy, the kind of songs she had listened to when she was young in Naples, and she sang along even when she got the words wrong, and no one corrected her, because the wrong words were part of the joy. And threaded through the music was Brielle's voice calling from the kitchen. "Nana, lunch is ready." Her voice carried through the main hallway, the same hallway she had once been forbidden to walk through after 9 at night, the same hallway she now crossed whenever she pleased, with ordinary footsteps, not light, not invisible, the footsteps of someone who belonged there. Ruth lived in the little cottage on the estate grounds, the 1-story house Declan had built for her in 4 months, with wide windows facing the garden, a nurse always there, and the chair she loved best, placed exactly where the afternoon sun fell through the glass. Every afternoon, the 2 old women sat together on the cottage porch. Katerina told stories in Italian, sometimes mixing in English, sometimes forgetting to mix it in at all, and speaking only Italian. And Ruth sat beside her without understanding a single word, nodding, smiling, holding Katerina's hand, because 2 old women do not need a shared language to understand that they are no longer sitting alone. Brielle watched them each afternoon from the kitchen window, and every time she did, she thought of the thread she had held for 5 years, that fragile thread tying both old women to the world, and how it was no longer fragile now. Now it was a porch, an afternoon sunbeam, a hand holding another hand. Brielle was no longer the housekeeper. There was no official title for what she was in that house. Katerina called her nipote, granddaughter, and no one corrected her because no one wanted to. And perhaps Katerina was more right than any title could have been. Brielle still cooked, but now because she wanted to, not because anyone forced her, and she cooked by her own recipes, not the recipes Portia had inspected and rejected and sent back to be made again. She still cared for Katerina, but now the old woman lived in the first-floor sitting room, the room with windows looking out over the garden, not the low-ceilinged attic with its heat and cold. Declan was still Declan, cold with the world outside the iron gates, still holding meetings in the basement, still signing orders no one dared ask about, still the boss whose name made people lower their voices when they spoke it. But in the kitchen, when Brielle stood at the stove stirring a pot of tomato sauce, he would come up behind her, rest a hand at her waist, bend to kiss her hair, and say, "Smells good." Brielle would not turn around. "It's pasta, Declan, not a 5-star restaurant." "I meant you." Brielle would shake her head, but the corner of her mouth would lift, and he would smile. The smile only Katerina, Ruth, and Brielle had ever seen. The smile the entire underworld would never believe existed if someone told them about it. And as for the Kensington family, Preston failed to repay the $12 million within 90 days. Declan did not need to make any dramatic move. He only let information travel to exactly the right places at exactly the right time, because in the underworld, when Moretti's boss called in a debt and did not grant an extension, it was a sentence, not a death sentence, something worse, a sentence that meant no one would ever do business again with the man carrying it. Allies turned away, banks closed their doors, partners pulled out. In 6 months, the Kensington family went from old money to bankruptcy, and Preston vanished from every negotiating table as though he had never once sat there. Portia sold all her designer things, moved into a small apartment in Jersey City, cooked her own meals, washed her own dishes, scrubbed her own floors. And every time she knelt down on her kitchen floor with a rag in her hand, she thought of Brielle. Not because Brielle had cursed her, but because Brielle had been right. In the end, she understood what it cost. 3 months after the day Portia rolled her suitcase out through the front door of the Moretti estate, Brielle saw her again in the last place either of them would have expected. A ShopRite in Jersey City, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Brielle was driving Ruth to a routine doctor's appointment and had stopped at the supermarket on the way back to pick up a few things. She was standing in the checkout line, holding a small basket, when she heard the cashier's voice rise louder than necessary. "Ma'am, your card was declined. Do you have another one?" Brielle looked up, and she saw Portia. Portia was standing at a register 3 people ahead of her. Thinner, older, her hair no longer done every week, no designer clothes, no sunglasses, a simple black blouse, jeans, a pair of flats the Portia of 6 months earlier would never have worn. Portia dug through her bag, her hand trembling, searching for another card. Finding none, and the cashier was looking at her with the expression Brielle knew by heart, because she had received that look thousands of times in her life, the look of someone looking down on another person because that person did not have enough money to pay. The line behind Portia had started to notice. One person sighed. Another checked the time, and Portia stood there, her hands shaking, her face flushed red, her head lowered, and Brielle realized she was looking at a woman being humiliated at a supermarket checkout because her card had been declined. Brielle stood 3 people away. She could have turned aside. She could have pretended not to see. She could have stood there and watched, exactly the way Portia had once stood in the back doorway of the estate, sipping wine, and watching Brielle kneel on the concrete beside the dogs. 5 seconds. Brielle stood there for 5 seconds, and in those 5 seconds, she saw everything again. The hot attic room, the burning concrete beneath her knees, the 2 dogs eating beside her, the 3 laughing emojis, the 6 women holding wine glasses, and Portia, filming. Then Brielle stepped forward. She passed the 3 people in line, went to the register, laid down her card, and said to the cashier, "I'll cover it." Portia looked up, recognized Brielle, and something in her collapsed, not onto the floor, but inward, the kind of collapse other people only see in eyes suddenly full of tears and lips opening without sound. Brielle did not hug her. She did not say, "I forgive you." She looked at Portia and said 4 words, "Everyone deserves to eat." Then she took her things, walked out the door, did not look back. That evening, Brielle told Declan about it. They were sitting on the back porch, on the same concrete step, shoulders touching, and when she finished, Declan asked, "Why did you pay for her?" Brielle looked out at the dark yard where Caesar and Nero were asleep beside the fence, and she said, "Because I don't want to become the kind of person she used to be. If I stand there and watch her get turned away at a checkout line without doing anything, then how am I any different from her standing there watching me kneel in the yard?" Declan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, his voice lower than usual, lower than when he spoke to rivals or business partners, so low Brielle had to lean a little closer to hear him. "What I fear most isn't my enemies, not the police, not the feds. What I fear most is you walking out the front door of this house and not coming back. Brielle turned to look at him. "I already walked through the front door," she said, "and I'm still here." Declan lowered his head, and he kissed her. For the first time. Not hurried, not the blazing kind of kiss from the movies. Slow, gentle, the way he should have treated every important thing in his life but had never known how, until a brown-haired woman taught him how to crack eggs at 5 a.m. in a kitchen that still smelled faintly burnt. The next morning, Brielle walked through the garden to the little cottage to visit Ruth. The early sunlight came through the leaves and scattered golden patches across the path. She opened the door. Ruth was sitting by the window, the morning light on her face, her hands resting in her lap, looking out at the garden. Brielle sat down beside her, took her hand, the small, wrinkled, dry, warm hand. Ruth turned and looked at her, and this time, with no explanation, no medical reason, no miracle, just a single moment when the part of her mind that had not entirely forgotten suddenly brightened like a lamp. Someone turned up one notch, she said. Brielle, her name, correctly, for the first time in years. Then Ruth turned back to the garden as though nothing had happened. Brielle stood there, tears running down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. She did not need to. Ruth remembered. Even if only for a second, she remembered. Outside on the cottage porch, Caterina was dozing in a wicker chair, the Italian radio on the little table beside her still playing music, a smile resting on her lips. Caesar and Nero were stretched out across the porch floor, not standing guard, only lying there in peace, their tails moving slowly in the morning sun. And the gray stone house beyond the wrought iron gates, the 12-bedroom house that had once been as silent as a tomb, the house Brielle had entered through the back kitchen door at 22 and knelt in the backyard on hot concrete at 27, that house was no longer cold. It was warm. And Brielle Ashford, the woman who had once knelt on burning concrete beside 2 dogs, was the reason why. Brielle's story reminds us that patience is not weakness, but the fiercest strength a human being can possess. That silent sacrifice for the people we love is never meaningless, even when it looks like kneeling on hot concrete. And that grace, true grace, is not having no right to slam the door, but having every reason to slam it, and still choosing to open it instead. If this story touched you, hit like so Brielle can reach more people. Share it with someone you know who is quietly carrying something for the sake of someone they love. And subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you don't miss the next stories. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever met, or known, someone like Brielle in your life? Someone who silently endures everything so the people they love can live in peace? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We listen to every story, every line written from the deepest part of your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days beside the people you love. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.